All right, folks. Hope everyone had a good weekend. Welcome back. So today we are slated to finish up our discussion of Plato's Republic. And so we've been persistently a bit behind. We've got to try to catch up today and finish up or at least almost entirely finish up our discussion of the Republic. Let's see how well we do on that. And then next class, we're slated to read a little bit of Aristotle. So please be attentive to the syllabus and the specific sections of Aristotle's Politics from his text called The Politics from our textbook that I've asked you to read. So there's just a selection of various short chapters. Again, the politics is broken up into different books and sections. So I've given you a selection of those to read for next class. So we'll discuss Aristotle a little bit. We'll not be spending much time, unfortunately, on Aristotle. But difficult decisions to make here and what we can fit in without rushing things too much and overloading you with too much information that we can't really cover properly. So, giving you a little bit to read from Aristotle to discuss and to kind of complement a little bit of our discussion of Plato and Socrates previously. And then we move on, we kind of make a big jump in time and place, and we move to kind of Renaissance Italy and look at Machiavelli's The Prince for next week. Um, I also there's also been of course the question of your first term assignment. And because we have to get through a lot of material today, I don't think I'm going to have a chance to talk to you about that assignment today, but I will post it in between today's class and Thursday's class, and then we will discuss it more fully on Thursday. And it will be due before, just on the Friday before the reading break, which will be so it'll be the Friday the 12th, I believe, of June is when that assignment will be due. And then, of course, things are quite compressed. This is a concentrated summer course, so you've got that week then to be kind of reviewing and catching up. And then when we come back, the Tuesday after the break week is when we have our in-person exam on June 23rd, I believe. So just be keeping all of that in mind, but we will talk about the assignment. I'll post it between today's class and next class, and then we will talk about it fully next class. John, you have a question?
Yes. Why is such a big time jump? Why are we not covering anything from the Middle Ages or late antiquity?
Well, like I just said, we've just got tough decisions to make, and there's a
Ah,
lot of authors to cover. And there's a kind of there's, you can configure a course like this in a whole bunch of different ways. It's on the classics of political thought. We've got lots of different possibilities there. And, we're only ever going to get a small selection of the classics of political thought to cover. And so it's kind of just the specific text that I've selected that we have time for. Like I said, I'm trying to balance with not trying to do too much. In the past, I've found that if you try to cram in a huge amount of readings and texts, it's just a bit too overwhelming and you don't get much out of any of them. So I've decided to spend a bit more time on each text and to do a lot fewer of them. And so it's kind of unfortunate constraints of the time we have together in the class.
is that why Thomas More's Utopia was omitted?
It's why endless texts that we could recount are omitted. Yeah. Okay, so let's jump back into our discussion of the Republic and our again, as I've stressed before, we are spending a lot more time on the Republic as our first big text. We are spending a lot more time on the Republic than we do on other texts, just to kind of really sink our teeth into this text in particular, as we get used to our reading these classics of political theory. So we have left off last class in a discussion of a section from books 5 and 6 that I have asked you to read. So I only asked you to read a section from books 5 and 6 that is 471C to 502C. Those are of course, the paragraph numbers that I have, and that section goes from partway through book 5 to partway through book 6. And the theme of that section of the text is really around the relationship between philosophy and politics. So we're coming back to a theme that we talked about with respect to Socrates in the Apology, and how Socrates kind of suggested that the philosopher should have little to nothing to do with politics, that they should try to avoid politics and just kind of do the work of philosophy outside of the assembly, and that's the best kind of task for an approach for the philosopher. And so here we come back to these themes, but we get kind of Plato's kind of discussion of them with in light of the city that has been constructed. And so you get both a sense of a reflection on Plato's own society and the discussion about that, and like the way things are in the actually existing world. And you get the contrast between that and the ideal city that Plato has constructed here in the text. So you get kind of a back and forth discussion in this section of the text, the ideal relationship between philosophy and politics, and the kind of actual lived reality of the relationship between philosophy and politics. Let me go to my PowerPoint here and we'll jump back in. Okay, so this is where we left off. And we left off talking about the metaphor of the city as a ship. And Plato or Socrates and his friends here are discussing in the text the question of the question that they see people would be raising if they heard the seemingly preposterous idea that Plato has offered to us here, that the philosophers should actually be rulers in this city, that philosophy and politics should ideally become fused in the perfect city, the ideal city, uh, and that the philosophers should actually be the ones to govern. And they say people would think this is an outrageous idea because people think of philosophers as either useless or evil. And so Socrates, the character of Socrates, has to kind of contend with these arguments. And he says, well, yes, in response to the first issue, the issue of philosophers being thought of as useless, he raises this metaphor of the city as a ship. And again, as we talked about, the philosopher is kind of treated as the stargazer who's out on the deck of the ship looking up at the stars. Everyone else thinks that they're useless, that they're just kind of a star. They're kind of laughed at and mocked as a stargazer. But really, what the person who is the stargazer, the things that they are learning, they're studying the stars and they're actually learning how to navigate the ship, which is a skill that nobody else has on the ship. They are, in fact, becoming the true captain, the real captain of the ship, the one who actually possesses wisdom, the one who actually possesses the knowledge of how to rule, how to guide and lead the ship. But nobody else understands that that's what they're doing, and so they are mocked. And that's how the philosopher is seen as useless. Now, I said last class that I was going to leave you with the metaphor to think about a little bit more. So, of course, it's not just the stargazer on the ship. The ship that he says is the city, but then there's a couple other kind of characters. There's the ship owner, who is he's all that he says about the ship owner is that he's kind of bigger and kind of stronger than everybody else, but he doesn't see well, he doesn't hear well, he doesn't have the knowledge of how to captain the ship, but he owns the ship. So this is kind of some kind of figure there. And then there's these sailors who clamor for power and they seek to win the affection of the ship owner. But they kind of fight amongst themselves, they compete amongst themselves, they clamor against each other and throw each other overboard. And but they want to rule the ship, they want to captain the ship. They want the ship owner to designate them the captain, but they don't have the knowledge of how to captain and navigate the ship either. So who do you think these two figures represent? Like who or what is the ship owner, and who is represented by these sailors? Any thoughts on, if there's the philosophers out on the stargazers out on the deck. Who else, who are these other figures on the ship, if this is a metaphor of the city, and how the city functions? Any thoughts on who, say, the sailors are, who are clamoring for rule, clamoring for power, but don't have knowledge of how to actually captain the ship? Any thoughts on who they are? Okay, in the chat, Salim is saying elites of the city. Yeah, sure. That's one, certainly one possibility. The elites, the politicians, the sophists, the people who are trying to gain power in the city, but who don't actually know the good of the city. They don't study the city. They don't actually have the knowledge of what it takes. John, you want to?
That could mean a lot of things. It could mean politicians, it could mean sophists, it could mean nobles. It could also mean conquerors. Because if we take into context the time in which Socrates and Plato lived in, there had recently been a takeover of the city of Athens by the Spartans and the installation of tyrants.
Sure, sure. I mean, really, Plato could be talking about any power seeker, anyone who deeply desires to rule, but does not have the adequate knowledge to rule in the interest of the city, and who doesn't have a proper picture of the good to guide them. Now, so the sailors, perhaps that's a bit more straightforward. They're clamoring for power on the ship, but they're appealing to the ship owner. And so I guess the question is, who is the ship owner? This figure who, let me find the actual description that's very brief, but the way they describe so this is on 488B. The ship owner is taller and stronger than everyone else on board, but he is hard of hearing, he is a bit short-sighted, and his knowledge of seafaring is correspondingly deficient. So if the elites, the politicians, the people seeking power in the city are the sailors, who's the ship owner? Person who owns the ship, but doesn't have good judgment, bigger and stronger, taller than everyone else, but doesn't have good senses and doesn't know how to captain the ship either. Any thoughts on who the ship owner is? I don't know, John, if your hand is still up from previously or if it's up
No,
again.
I have an answer.
Go ahead.
It is the current ruling class of the city. The ones that already have the power and not the ones who are desiring the power.
Perhaps. I mean, that's one possibility that it's kind of just an indication of the uh the current ruling class versus those who their competitors. So perhaps he's just kind of drawing a distinction that way. Um, and so that's one possibility that they own the city in that sense. They are the current power holders. Uh, Jacob in the chat is saying the Senate. So okay, so there's again some sense of like the current power holders. Any other thoughts on who the ship owner could be here? Again, we don't have any necessarily authoritative account of what the truth of this is. Okay, Salim is saying in the chat, I thought it was the population, like the citizens. And sure, that's another very possible interpretation here, that the ship owner is like the assembly, is like the people, the masses. They are technically the owners of the city. That perhaps might be why he's saying they are taller and stronger than everyone else. Um, and they kind of own the city. It is their city, but they don't know how to rule the city either. So it may well be the kind of masses, the population, the citizens of the city, the assembly that he's pointing to, and that kind of jives with some things that he says in this same section of the text as well. So that's another kind of possible interpretation. Nonetheless, the main point of the story is to talk about the role of the philosopher and how no one else on the city has the proper knowledge that is needed to guide the city, and they mock the person that does or the person that could. So that's the philosopher. So that's an explanation of why the philosopher is thought of as useless, that the everyone else doesn't understand the knowledge that is required to rule the city, to govern the city. So of course they're going to think they're useless. The other side of the challenge here is the sense that philosophers are evil. And so Plato writes into the story here an argument about that. Why is it that people consider those those they associate with philosophy, why do they consider them evil? When Plato here, through the character of Socrates, is arguing the opposite, that they are the best. They are the people who are good. And so there's a sense here of like um uh there's quite a contrast between the perception of philosophers as evil and Plato's contention that they are the most moral people and should therefore rule. And what Plato ends up arguing here in this section of the text is that um, really what happens is the people who have philosophical natures in the city and who people tend to associate as the philosophers, people like the sophists, the people who seem to they appear like the philosophers and they have a kind of philosophical nature. They like to think and debate and they have a kind of skill with words, and those people, Plato argues here, do often become evil because they are actually corrupted by being raised in a, a, a kind of evil city. So, what Plato talks about here is the corruption of those with the best natures, or those who might otherwise become auxiliaries or rulers. They might, in his ideal city, become these kind of guardian classes. Instead, they become corrupted in this city, in the actually existing cities. And he describes this in a bunch of different ways. He says, these people are talented, and the people around them seek to exploit them for their talents and their intelligence from a very early age. So they get used by their family and friends for their skills, and those people kind of channel those skills. The people raising them kind of channel those skills towards kind of nefarious purposes, or at least not very good purposes, private interest rather than the public interest, public good. But he also describes what it's like to be raised in a city that's governed by, the masses, the assembly, the masses that gather in the assembly, that make up the assembly in a city like Athens. And what Plato describes is that when you are raised in this city, you kind of are up against this beast. So he describes the mob. He uses different metaphors: the mob, the beast. And so he talks about the fact that when you're raised in that, what you start to do is you start to like learn and try to predict the movements of the beast. And so you learn, oh, well, this kind of thing makes the beast happy. And this kind of thing makes the beast mad. And so you start to learn your standards of good and bad from the reactions of the beast, from the reaction of the mob, the masses. And you start to use your words accordingly. So you use the word good to mean that which pleases the beast, and you start using the word evil or bad to mean that which displeases the beast. And so you get fundamentally corrupted. your standards come to be learned around the whims of the mob, of the masses. So you get socialized, in other words, into kind of groupthink of the city. This is how people get to be corrupted. They don't learn what's right. Instead, they learn what's popular. So again, this is something very understandable to us in our current day and in contemporary democracy. And so you get a sense here of like there's a peer pressure going on. There's a kind of social stigma going on that channels you and teaches you and keeps you within certain parameters so that you kind of don't step outside of that and you learn the conventional thinking rather than the truth. And when you learn conventional thinking, he uses this metaphor repeatedly in this section of the text of like it's of kind of sheep being, and goes back to this kind of metaphor of sheep or of like animals being raised in a field, but the grass is poisonous. And so they are grazing on, then ingesting grass that is poisonous, and they're taking it in themselves. And they're incorporating it into them. And so they are becoming corrupted. And so instead of learning what the philosophers would learn in the good city, the ideal city, instead, they simply learn the prevailing ways that make the masses happy or upset, and they fundamentally become corrupted. And he adds further to this that when the people with the most talent are corrupted, that actually means that they become the worst people of all. They become the most evil. Because, the basic easiest way to think about this is that, what are you more afraid of? A thief who is like exceptionally smart, um, or one that is not very bright and talented. And so, the argument here is that those with these great philosophical talents, when they become corrupted, they become the worst of all. And that's why people associate philosophy with actually being evil. John, you have a question?
Yes. As Plato himself was an Athenian, did he ever stop to think that he himself might also be corrupted?
Well, he may well have, but of course, he's offering a perspective on what defines corruption and what doesn't. Whether or not any of us, I mean, the best any of us can do is use our own judgment in our own time and place. And so he's offering a perspective on what defines corruption. And certainly he's suggesting that he's kind of excluding himself from the conventional ways of Athenian society and thinking that he has a kind of enlightened perspective on that and is trying to suggest that enlightened path and enlightened perspective to others. Now, whether or not he contemplated whether he uh, was himself too corrupted from living in that society to offer such a perspective, that would be a historical question that I'm not sure that we know the answer to, whether he reflected on that. But but even if he had reflected on that, again, there's not necessarily any objective way that any of us could escape our own socialization and time and place, even as we reflect critically upon our own socialization, our own time and place. And so that's a kind of conundrum for all of us to face, is how do we think beyond the limitations of our own context and our own socialization, and the limitations that we experience from that.
Because the thing is, if he is corrupted, his views on what corruption is, and therefore his definition of it, may be flawed.
Of course, yes, they might be. Yes. Again, but that could be said of literally anyone. So it doesn't necessarily tell us anything specific. We have to engage with the arguments at hand, and render our own. They help us to think again about our own judgments, and that's part of the point of kind of trying to think through texts like this, is that we are all in this struggle of trying to think um, kind of against our own prevailing uh, um, the prevailing wisdom of our own socialization, and yet knowing that we are to some extent constrained by those limitations. Okay, so this is kind of Plato's response, and why he kind of ultimately um uh kind of by the end of this section again reiterates a kind of position on the relationship between philosophy and politics that both harkens back to what Socrates said in the Apology, but also moves beyond it to some extent. By the end of this section, Plato, through the character of Socrates, basically says, yes, so for all of these reasons, in actually existing societies where this corruption is so deep, the best path for the philosopher is to kind of take shelter. They use the metaphor of taking shelter from the storm, and to try to just live out your days doing philosophy, but kind of sheltering from the worst effects of the persecution that comes from being a philosopher and trying to seek the truth in a corrupted society. But he says at the same time that if in the ideal city, which is not just a theory, it could actually come to be, but it would be very rare for it to come to be. But in the ideal, that same philosopher who's simply condemned to kind of sheltering from the storm in actually most existing societies, they in the ideal city would actually be the ones with full political power. They would become the lawgivers. So let me just kind of go again back to the text before moving on here. This is at the close to the end of the section I have assigned for you here. And so this is 496C. And so they're talking about the small group of philosophers in the city, in like the contemporary city, the actually existing city. And they say, now those who have become members of this little group have tasted how sweet and blessed a possession philosophy is. At the same time, they have also seen the insanity of the masses and realized that there is nothing healthy, so to speak, in public affairs, and that there is no ally with those with whose aid the champion of justice can survive, that instead he would perish before he could profit either his city or his friends, and be useless both to himself and to others, like a man who has fallen among wild animals and is neither willing to join them in doing injustice, nor sufficiently strong to oppose the general savagery alone. Taking all of this into his calculations, he keeps quiet and does his own work, like someone who takes refuge under a little wall from a storm of dust or hail driven by the wind. Seeing others filled with lawlessness, the philosopher is satisfied if he can somehow lead his present life pure of injustice and impious acts, and depart from it with good hope, blameless and content. So again, here he reiterates in different words the kind of argument of Socrates in his trial. However, by the end of this section, like I said, they make clear that in fact the same group would be rulers, however, in the ideal city if there were that chance event that allowed philosophers to be kings or kings to become philosophers. Now, this section also foreshadows something that we'll talk about with respect to Book 8 shortly, which is Plato's condemnation, his very robust critique of democracy. And so one of the peculiar kind of things about studying Plato here is that we often think about Plato as the kind of one of the most famous representatives of ancient Athens, which is often held up, as I've talked about before, as the birthplace of democracy, as this kind of great experiment, in some ways at least, of a democratic form of rule, which we in contemporary democracies continue to like look back to as the kind of one, at least one of the central founding birthplaces of democracy. And yet, this great figure from ancient Athens, Plato, actually kind of despises democracy. And you get that sense here in this section of the text when he's talking about these insane mobs and the people, the masses as like a beast. And so you get that sense, but we'll come back to that in Book 8 and see how he actually talks about democracy directly and how the direct critique of democracy that he offers. But before we get there, we have to take a brief stop in Book 7. And in Book 7, we get, and again, I've just assigned to you a brief section at the beginning of from the beginning of Book 7, because it offers one of the most famous metaphors of, there are lots of famous metaphors from this text, but it offers us one of these central metaphors or allegories from this text, and that is the allegory of the cave as a way of thinking about the current state of knowledge in actually existing societies, and it also provides a way of thinking about the various steps towards full enlightenment and to full or true knowledge that human beings can achieve. So this is a story about enlightenment and about human enlightenment, human education, and how and of human knowledge and of how what kind of levels of knowledge there are, and it's a metaphor for the kind of path that can be taken towards higher knowledge. And it also provides a bit of a metaphor for Socrates and his friends to discuss the education of the guardians or the rulers in the ideal city and their training as they become philosopher kings. Although, because I haven't assigned you all of book 7, you don't get that full picture. But I did want to at least touch on the basic metaphor of the cave to get a sense of the picture that Plato paints here. So the allegory itself, it's a kind of complicated image, and so we've got to kind of try to piece through the different parts of it. Okay, so he says, imagine this cave down kind of below the surface, and you've got in this kind of cave, you've got a bunch of prisoners kind of chained, staring at a wall in front of them. Okay. And this kind of basically represents most people. The prisoners sitting kind of immobilized. All they can do is look ahead of them, looking at a wall in front of them. Okay. And then he says there's kind of a slope upwards behind them in the cave, and up kind of at the top of this slope is a fire. Okay, so there's a fire up above, kind of somewhere up above these, higher up in this cave, behind these kind of chained prisoners. And between the fire and the wall that the prisoners are staring at is like a little wall. Okay, stay with me. So there's a little wall between the fire and the like the cave wall. So it's this little wall is like a little built wall. And along this wall, there's some people that are walking, and they're holding up these little kind of objects, little figurines or little objects that are kind of poking out above the top of this little wall that they're walking along. Okay, so then what's happening is the fire is casting light forward, and it's kind of it's like capturing these little figurines that people are carrying along this little wall, and it's casting their shadows out forward towards and against the wall, the cave wall that the prisoners are looking at. Okay, so there's these objects that whose shadows are being cast by the light of the fire. The shadows are being cast again along the wall that the prisoners are looking at. And so the prisoners spend their lives looking at shadows, which are themselves but a reflection of these objects, these figurines that are being carried along this little wall behind the prisoners, up high above the prisoners. Okay, so what Plato says to us here is that the state of those prisoners is like most people's level of knowledge. What do they actually know? They spend their lives talking about and learning about the shadows. So they don't actually look at the thing itself, the object itself. They are looking at the shadow of this thing and thinking that it's the thing itself, but they don't know the difference. And so here, Plato is telling us this is the lowest kind of form of understanding or of knowledge. It's kind of basically just the realm of like false opinions where you um, look, you're kind of debating the shadows of the real things. So most people don't actually know what they're talking about. They don't know what they're looking at. They don't know what they're discussing. They don't know the objects that they claim to be talking about or discussing. They're just talking about shadows of those things, vague impressions of the real thing. So this is how the level of knowledge that most people have. Now, some people, he says, imagine somebody were to get freed from this condition. One of these prisoners were to get freed from this condition, and they were able to get up and turn around and walk for the first time up the cave a little bit and to see the little the little wall that and the people walking along the wall with their little figurines and objects and realize that this whole time they had been looking at shadows, not the actual object that was casting that shadow. Now, this for Plato is kind of the step of gaining greater knowledge of the physical world. Everything in this cave represents the what he calls the visible realm or the physical realm of our lives, the empirical realm, the material realm of our lives, the sensible realm. So, like a scientist does, the scientist tries to move beyond impressions of things and actually tries to study objects in nature, in the physical world. And so that's like somebody, one of these prisoners turning around, getting freed and turning around and going and studying the actual objects that are casting the shadows. So instead of just talking, let's just take an example of, say, instead of talking about vague impressions of, say, horses. Most people don't really understand horses. They don't really know much about them. They just kind of talk about them in vague impressions. But somebody who's actually studying horses, who's gaining like more scientific knowledge about horses, might actually go and like study the actual horses and learn about them. That would be like studying the figurine of the horse along that of the horse figurine that is kind of being carried along the wall. So you still get the sense that there's something not fully uh, true or real about the figurine. But this is the physical world. For Plato, our physical world is a fleeting realm. It's not the permanent realm of knowledge. Our physical, visible, sensible, material reality is kind of in constant flux, and it does not represent permanent universal truth. So you can study particular horses in the world, but that doesn't really help you to understand the real essence of the horse, just to kind of carry the metaphor a bit further. Now, the other part of this, of course, is the fire. What Plato says is that this person who has been able to turn around and come back up the cave, they would find it, because they've lived in darkness their whole lives with just like shadows and like very little light, they would find it extremely difficult to look at the fire because their eyes aren't really adjusted and they're not really capable. They'd find it very difficult. But maybe over time, they would start to be able to understand and see the fire. Now, again, the fire here represents our physical sun, the sun of the world, the sun that we all look up to in the sky. That is like represented here by the fire in the cave. Again, the cave itself is a representation of our physical, sensible realm in our lives, the realm where most of us spend all of our lives. However, what am I doing? A little over time, but I'll continue on here and then we'll take our break. Plato describes further that this person who's becoming enlightened will first be able to see the figurines and these objects that have actually been casting the shadows, and ultimately they will be able to see the fire, the sun of our physical world. But then they will realize that there's a pathway further up and out of the cave. So they will continue to proceed out of the cave entirely. And what Plato is getting at here is that you can leave the physical realm of our existence and enter the intelligible realm, what he calls the intelligible realm, the realm of pure reason, or the realm of the mind, the realm of the intellect. That is the realm that you can enter by leaving the physical realm behind and ascending up and out of the cave. So again, this is not a physical ascent. This is a ascent into your mind. But when you emerge out of the cave into the intelligible realm, the realm of the mind, what you see is the pure things that are. In other words, you see the essences of all of the fleeting physical objects of this world. You see the essences of them, the things that make them what they are. These are what Plato calls the forms. They are the ideal forms, the essential forms of anything and everything in the world that we use our language to talk about. You ascend into this intelligible realm and you enter the realm of the forms or the essences, the things that are, not the fleeting physical instantiations, but like the ideal essences of them. And so that is the realm that the philosopher really gets access to that regular people do not. And again, he says the last kind of phase after you've exited the cave is to actually be able to see the sun, not the fire, in the cave, but the son of the intelligible realm. Now, again, he's not talking about, he's already said the fire is already representing our physical sun, the sun in the sky that we look at. So, what does he mean by the sun in the intelligible realm? Well, he tells us the sun, the thing that gives light to everything in the philosophical or intelligible realm, is the form of the good. So it is the good. Again, this is the moral sensibility that is at the heart of Plato's theory of knowledge, that it is understanding of the good that illuminates everything else in the intelligible realm. So without an understanding of the good, what is good for all of us, you will never have a real understanding of everything else in our philosophical realities. Eva, yes, you have a question.
Did he ever connect that to like spirituality? Because I know like they used to believe in like a lot of gods. So did he ever like connect it to that?
Yes, I think that is the intelligible realm is also the realm in which we can access kind of the a divinity. It is the realm in which we can understand the true like meanings of the gods, and the that intelligible realm is in fact our kind of portal to the spiritual realm as well. It is kind of the realm of our of like the most fundamental parts of our soul. So that is quite connected for Plato. John.
Yes. Would the Platonic form of the good be considered a god itself?
Good question. I don't know actually whether that would itself be considered a god. Um, yeah, we would need to ask a kind of somebody more versed in kind of ancient Greek religion or spirituality. So I don't actually know. The way he talks about it here is much more, he does not bring that into the discussion here, but talks about it again as through the metaphor of our own sun that illuminates everything in our world, but he talks about it as the good. So he talks about it less through the realm of like the personification of gods or something here, and he talks about it instead through this kind of moral vocabulary of the good, that it is the good that helps us to see in the intelligible realm, in the philosophical realm. If we don't have an adequate understanding of that kind of moral component, ethical component of what goodness consists of, then we won't really be able to access any true knowledge um, in this kind of this true philosophical knowledge. So this is the basic ascent that the cave depicts. Now, they do use this metaphor again to say in the city, the people who are able to ascend out of the cave and to study the intelligible realm, the philosophers, they would want to remain in the intelligible realm, but they wouldn't be allowed to. In the ideal city, they would be forced essentially to come, they would be kind of convinced or compelled to come back down into the cave and to teach others and to guide others, to lead others, and to govern over the others within the cave, and to try to guide them with the sense of the sight that the intelligible realm has given them, that the sun has and the experience in the intelligible realm has given them, that they would now have a higher form of knowledge of the good to then bring into the city and or the depicted by the cave, and to help guide and lead the people there. So they kind of, and they wouldn't want to. He says they'd be kind of like, that's why it's kind of a problem when people want power. The people who actually should have power are those, he says, who don't actually want it. The philosophers don't want power. They would rather just be philosophers and stay in the intelligible realm and bask in the sun of that kind of that spiritual philosophical realm. But instead, they have to they have a duty to take their knowledge and use it for the good of the people in the cave. And so they would be compelled to go back down and to learn to guide and lead the people as best they can using the knowledge they have gained. So the allegory represents a number of things, as I've said previously. So just to recap, it kind of represents our current state of truth or knowledge, namely, we spend most of our times just looking at the shadows of the reflections of objects in nature. And we often don't even study those actual objects in nature themselves. But even those objects in nature are themselves, they have philosophical essences behind them that most people, even those who study nature, physical, sensible, visible nature, even they don't usually study and get to the essences, the philosophical essences behind all of the things in nature. And so you also get a sense here of the different levels of knowledge. So if the shadows on the cave wall are like a few steps removed from true knowledge, then you get a sense of like what one step above the objects casting the shadows, those are in one step above knowledge. And then going out of the cave and seeing all of the objects, the things outside of the cave, and realizing those are the true essences that the figurines in the cave are just imitating. So there's an actual essence of a horse, to go back to my metaphor, outside of the cave that you learn, you see, you study, but the objects in the cave are the figurines are just a kind of imitation of the essence, the form of the horse. So you learn that, and then you can ultimately start to see the sun, which is the form of the good that gives light to everything. You also get a depiction here of the nature and process of education and enlightenment, the kind of steps that are involved towards becoming enlightened. And you also finally get a sense of, they use the metaphor, the allegory here, to get a sense of the role of the philosophers and the basis for philosophical rule in the city, that the philosophers are the ones who leave the cave and then who come back down into the cave, despite the fact that they don't really want to, but they have to use philosophy. They are the true captains of the ship. They are the ones, to mix metaphors here, they are the ones who have true knowledge now, and they have to use it for the best interest of the city. Okay, let's take our break. How am I doing? Okay, way over time for our break. Let's take our break. Let's take 10 minutes. It's 1:38. Let's come back for 1:48, and we will jump into the last little bit of the text, Book 8, and the small section of Book 9 that we need to discuss to round out the Republic. Okay, so let's See you in 10 minutes. Okay, so we left off now our discussion of books, the allegory of the cave, brief, just touching on that to get a sense of that that important allegory that is offered in this in book 7. And then, of course, in the remainder of book 7, which I haven't asked you to read, they continue to talk about this process of education and training of the philosopher king and how they would go about being in the process. And as I've indicated before, by the end of book 7, they kind of suggested, yeah, they would be a many decades long process, this education of the philosopher king, and that they would only be able to really become a philosopher king after like the age of 50, and that they would be trained up in philosophy for a long time, and then they would be trained in the arts of rule and governance, and they would have to go back down the cave and the learn how to govern and rule the people, and only after a long apprenticeship kind of time there would they actually become philosopher kings themselves. So this is kind of where book 7 takes us. And then by book 8, what we get in book 8 is a picture of on the one hand, we get kind of a picture of the fall of the ideal city. And they kind of tell us a story about the degeneration of the ideal city into the lesser forms of constitution. So here we get really a way of Plato telling us kind of a story about what different kinds of political regimes are there in contrast to the ideal city that he has constructed here. What alternatives are there? What are the kind of more unjust forms of constitution that exist in the world, and how are they kind of related to one another? So he tells us a story about the ideal city kind of degenerating into its lesser forms, one after another, as he lays out this kind of these different lesser types of constitution or forms of organization of the city. And at the same time, he's actually telling us a story about the different kinds of unjust souls that there are, and that, again, can degenerate from one to the next to the next. And so you get a sense here of, in book 8, a discussion of the unjust constitutions, the unjust cities, and the unjust forms of souls that exist. And so we get a long kind of story of that. So let me jump back in. Okay, this is where we left off. So now let's move to book 8 and the degeneration of the just city and soul. So where have we started? Where we've started is with the ideal city. And of course, what kind of city is it, in fact, if we think about forms of government or forms of organization of the city-state? And so it is, in fact, either a type of monarchy or a type of aristocracy. So what Plato says is that if you've got one single philosopher king, then you've got a monarchy. But if you have a group of people who are a group of philosopher kings who all share ruling together, then you've got more of a class of people an elite class of the most wise, excellent people who rule the city. And so in that case, the perfect city would be an aristocracy. So the ideal city is either a monarchy or an aristocracy, ruled by either one or a few of the most excellent people in the city. But then Plato starts to talk about how the more unjust forms of city and the corresponding forms of the soul. So after the monarchy or aristocracy of the ideal city, you have what he calls a timocracy. And that is the rule of kind of what he calls like the rule in the rule of like a soldier class. So it's kind of the rule of the auxiliaries who used to be in the ideal city, the auxiliary class. Like, so it is when those who have great courage and honor, they have like kind of the military, the martial discipline and kind of character. They are the ones who rule the city. And so he talks about the rulers of this type of city as being quite disciplined and they're hierarchical. The city is kind of based on like strict obedience, and so it's quite rigid. And so this is the rule of the kind of spirited part of the soul as well. It's the kind of soul that is ruled by the spirited part of the soul rather than by its reason. This is the timocratic city and the timocratic soul. So they say this is when the city, where it starts out being ruled by virtue and goodness, it starts to be pulled away from goodness towards honor and courage as the kind of primary, as its kind of primary motivators. So this is the rule of kind of the martial rule or the soldierly rule of the city. And so he describes how this city takes root and then how it itself degenerates further into the next form of rule. And so, in contrast to the rule of the soldierly class or those with military training, martial rule, you have the rule of the moneyed classes, and that is an oligarchy. So oligarchy is the rule of the moneymakers. And here now you are starting to be ruled not by the rational part of the soul or of the city or the spirited part of the soul, guided by courage and honor. And instead, here you start to get ruled by what he calls the necessary appetites in us. So you can think of somebody who's a real spendthrift and who saves up money, who hoards wealth. They're not big, they're not necessarily very extravagant, they're not ruled by their unnecessary appetites. They're not extravagant in themselves, but they are they are savers. They are people who want to amass wealth. They're looking for security. They're looking to make sure that there's that all their needs are always going to be met. And so they, in that search for kind of security, they amass wealth and they ultimately become rulers. They take over rule from the soldier class. And so here you have a problem that arises, however, because this money-making class that rules in an oligarchy, and they will have like wealth qualifications so that only people who are the wealthy will be able to rule in this city. But from the rule of the wealthy class, what happens is that greater and greater poverty starts to emerge in the city because the wealthy seek to extract as much out of the masses as they can, and they start to impoverish them. The masses start going into greater and greater debt, and they become beholden to the money-making classes. And so you see the spread of debt and loans, and that creates masses of people who are quite impoverished and quite desperate, and that then leads to their rising up and kind of overthrowing the moneyed classes. And this is democracy, the rule of all, but in fact, the rule essentially, because the masses are almost always the poor, those without a great deal of wealth. The democracy is essentially the rule of the poor because they outnumber everyone else. So democracy, Plato understands as rule of the masses, rule of the poor masses, essentially. And here you get kind of if we think about it with respect to the soul, this is the rule of kind of both the necessary and unnecessary appetites. Like all the appetites take their turn ruling. So anyone and everyone gets to rule in a democracy. There are no differentiations of virtue. It's just a free-for-all. Everyone gets a share of ruling. All of the necessary and unnecessary appetites take a turn. And so this is kind of the democratic form. It is the fourth lowest form it turns out to be the second worst kind of regime. So here, as I alluded to earlier, Plato really has a lot of disdain for democracy because these are he's ordered these in like order of like the esteem he holds them in and how good they are. He actually thinks democracy is the fourth worst. And finally, democracy, from that rule of the masses, ultimately, he says, there's like great freedom in democracy. It's a free-for-all where everyone gets to share in ruling and everyone values the freedom to do what they like. And out of great freedom emerges extreme tyranny. So out of that lawlessness, there is a great tyrant who rises up and promises to kind of vindicate the masses and to bring order to things, but really they are completely ruled by their own lust for power. In other words, the unnecessary appetites rule the tyrant, and the tyrant comes to rule who lusts for power and power above anything else. And so they are able to convince the masses to give them power, and then they use that power to serve their own private interest. And that is the great tyrant, or the tyranny that emerges from the freedom of democracy. So Plato writes explicitly here that from the extreme freedom of democracy emerges the extreme tyranny. So this is the story he tells us of the rule of the city. You ruled by the rational, the philosopher kings. Then you slide into a timocracy ruled by the more soldier classes. Then you slide into further degenerate into the rule of the moneyed classes. Then you get ruled by the masses, and then you get ruled by the self-interested tyrant. These are the corrupt, non-ideal, unjust forms of rule. And he, along the way, alludes to the kind of souls that correspond to each of these unjust cities, the unjust souls that correspond to each, how they are ruled by the spirit, or ruled by the necessary appetites, or ruled by the necessary and unnecessary appetites, or ruled by the unnecessary appetites alone. Now, I want to spend a couple of minutes here focusing more specifically on democracy, because, of course, this is so relevant to our own context, because in our time and place, we tend to profess a great adherence to democracy. And as I've alluded to earlier, we tend to look back at ancient Athens as kind of the hallmark, as the birthplace of democracy, and we kind of hold it up in this way. And yet, as I alluded to, Plato, who is one of our most famous representatives of Athenian society, is actually a great critic of democracy. And keep in mind here, Athens is now, in Plato's time, has passed its kind of golden age where it was thriving, and it was a great center for prosperity and wealth and philosophy and science and art and military power. And now it is in a real period of decline. And so the association of that decline with democracy is quite strong for Plato. And so he's quite attentive to the faults of democracy. So what does he say about democracy in Book 8, specifically as he goes through this story about the degeneration of the 5 different forms of government and soul? Well, first thing to pay attention to is that it's the kind of, it's hard to put this in the right way, the second worst type of regime, or no, the fourth out of 5 in the hierarchy of regimes. So it is a truly corrupt and kind of unjust form of rule for Plato. He also argues that democracy, or rule of the poor, the masses, arises out of oligarchy, rule of the rich or the wealthy, as the rich exploit and impoverish the masses in their quest for money, and as bad discipline spreads throughout the city. So he talks about democracy emerging from the exploitation of the rich in in oligarchy that impoverishes the masses, spreads kind of a lack of work and a lack of work ethic and a lack of discipline and extreme kind of debt riddenness of the masses. And that kind of deeply corrupts the city and ultimately leads to the masses rising up against the moneyed elite and taking the oligarchy into a democracy where the masses rule themselves. Plato also argues that paradoxically, democracy looks like the most beautiful type of regime. He says it is, let me just kind of go to the text here. This is 557c on page 212 of our textbook. Socrates says, it looks then as though it is the most beautiful of all the constitutions. He's talking about democracy. For just like an embroidered cloak, embroidered with every kind of ornament, it is embroidered with every sort of character, and so would appear to be the most beautiful. And most people, he says, would judge it to be the most beautiful. So democracy, he says, is characterized by freedom, by equality, tolerance of all different kinds of characters. All different types of characters can flourish. Now, notice here, this is where it's important to pause on, because Plato is directly challenging one of our most centrally held beliefs and values about democracy. We tend to say democracy is great because it allows for freedom, because it allows for equality of people, because it allows for diversity to flourish. But Plato, of course, as we've seen, if we think about the ideal city he set up, Plato is not a fan of these things. He wants hierarchy and he wants rule by the most kind of intelligent, philosophical, and yes, moral, but like this kind of elite class of people who will basically judge for what is good for everyone else. And so in democracy, this is a perversion of what Plato thinks of as the ideal, because every type of person is able to flourish, every type of person is able to participate in ruling. And this creates great diversity and it makes a beautiful embroidery, he says. It looks very beautiful, but it actually, that beauty masks a deep form of corruption and kind of perversion of like the actual proper ordering of things. So Plato describes here that like in a democracy, all proper ordering is turned upside down or it's leveled. So he says parents try to act like their children. They don't act like parents. And he says teachers try to win the favor of their students rather than teaching them, rather than being people to guide them. They seek to flatter their students rather than to guide them and lead them to the right way. all different hierarchies. Again, Plato's in a time of slavery, living in a time of slavery, and he says, oh yeah, this is like slaves and masters all becoming equal to one another. So equality is something deeply antithetical to Plato and his ideas about how the city should be organized. And he critiques that quite strongly here. Meanwhile, democracy does not help order the souls of its citizens, which is what the ideal city would do. The ideal city, the philosopher kings would help order properly as much as possible. It wouldn't be entirely possible, but it would help, they would help to, as much as possible, order the souls of the people in the city so that they could be as happy as their constitutions would allow them to be. But in a democracy, the souls of the citizens are totally disordered. It allows the appetites to rule, leading to the breakdown of all hierarchies and laws and allowing disorder and anarchy to spread. Nobody wants to rule. Or actually stated the other way around, everyone wants to rule in a democracy, but no one wants to be ruled. And so there is basically an overthrowing of all authority and hierarchy, and this leads to disorder and anarchy. And finally, as I stated earlier, from the extreme freedom of democracy arises extreme slavery as democracy degenerates into tyranny, as those ruled by the unnecessary appetites who just have a lust for power and whose souls are completely disordered in themselves, they come to rule. They win the approval of the masses, and then they come to rule, and then they kind of turn all of their power towards their own interest and do not end up being the vindicator or the savior of the people. They end up being the greatest predator on the people. So this is the story that Plato tells about democracy. It arises from an also quite bad form of government, but one that's better than democracy, which is oligarchy for Plato. And it degenerates further into the worst form of government altogether, and the worst form of soul, which is the tyrannical soul, or the tyranny of the city, a tyrannical city. That's what democracy ultimately becomes. So again, Plato is no fan at all of democracy, and is in fact quite a stark critic of democracy, despite living in the city that is known to be and is held up in many cases as the birthplace of democracy. All right, now we have just one last kind of set of arguments to bring out. Just got a couple minutes left here, and then maybe we'll kind of come back to the discussion briefly before jumping into Aristotle, but we're largely at the end here because I've just asked you to read a few short pages at the end of Book 9 to see where the argument comes back to. Remember at the end of Book 4. At the end of Book 4, they said, okay, well, we've defined justice. And if justice in the soul looks like what we have said, a soul that isn't properly ruled, a soul whose constitution is overturned, where the appetites rule instead of the reason of the soul. If that's the way that the soul is ruled, if that's what injustice does to the soul, then how could it ever be good to be unjust? For your soul to be fundamentally corrupted. But then they set the argument aside and they only come back to it here at the end of book 9. And they do so with what Socrates calls a kind of final image of the soul. And again, it has its 3 parts. So the final image of the tripartite soul, he's talked about it before as reason, spirit, appetites. And here he puts a new metaphor on it, a new image. And he says, imagine you've got a human. And within the skin of the human being, you have 3 parts. And one of them is itself a small human. Okay, kind of confusing, but you've got this human part within the human body. That, of course, represents reason in some way, the highest part of the soul. Then he says, there's the second part of the soul is the lion. And the lion represents the spirit, the courageous, honor-loving part of the soul. And then you have a many-headed beast. So inside of every human, he says, you've got a human part, you've got a lion part, and you've got a multi-headed, many-headed beast. And they're all wrapped in together into the body of any human being. So they comprise the kind of the soul of any human being. Every human has these 3 parts, again, corresponding to reason, spirit, appetites. And what he says here is that injustice is the thing that feeds the many-headed beast and makes it grow stronger and stronger. Or perhaps it feeds the lion. These beasts inside of us, as opposed to the properly human part of us, which is the unique part about human beings, its reason. Instead, injustice feeds the beasts within us, the lion, and more importantly, the many-headed, multi-headed beast. The various appetites. That's what's represented by the many heads of the beast. And injustice then causes those beasts, especially the many-headed beast, to get stronger and stronger and to enslave the human part of us. So if injustice were to if we were to be more and more unjust, and injustice would have its way, we would become ruled by the many-headed beast within us. And it would enslave the human part of us. It would enslave the lion part of us. And it would drag them around and make them do its bidding, so that our reason and our spirit would all be channeled towards fulfilling our appetites, rather than be guided by a sense of what's good for us, or a sense of honor or courage. And so our soul would be turned upside down. And this is the crucial problem with injustice. It corrupts the soul and it would make it so that we could never have any lasting happiness. We could never have any lasting contentment. We would never be able to achieve anything worthwhile, because we would be so ruled by our impulses, by our appetites, that we could never dedicate ourselves to what's good for us or to some higher purpose. And so we would be ultimately be miserable, not achieve anything with our lives, not be able to be respected by others or to develop relationships with others. And we would um, uh, we would ultimately therefore not be happy or profitable. And so this is Plato's kind of response to ultimately to Thrasymachus's challenge that just injustice is better than justice. And Plato wants to say, no, it could never be better. Injustice could never be better than justice because it fundamentally corrupts and overturns our soul. Okay, so we can think about this a bit more, and we can maybe talk about it at the beginning of Thursday's class. On Thursday, as I said, we'll also talk about your first assignment in the class. But for today, we will leave it there, and that largely will wrap up our discussion of Plato's Republic. So we'll come back and wrap it up a little bit more before we turn to Aristotle next class, but please make sure now to turn, if you haven't already, to turn your attention to Aristotle's Politics, where we will go next class. Okay, so I will stop there, and I can stick around and answer a couple of questions if folks have them, but we will leave it there. And if you need to go, then feel free. But I'll continue recording if folks have questions that are relevant to others. Anything at all? Okay, I'm not seeing any. So I'll stop recording then, and I will see you all on Thursday.